Today, I will demonstrate making embossed cables on the knitting machine. This is part of the series of videos showing on the screen now. You'll probably find it helpful to see all the videos to get the most out of this one. We are working on cables from this book, Pretzel Logic. It's volume 2 of this 2-part set, all about many kinds of cables on knitting machines. For embossed cables, you definitely have to have 2 beds, but it may be Japanese machines or European machines. Any 2-bed setup will do the trick. You will also definitely need weights of some kind, whether you use the ribber comb and weights on it or use the substitutes that I often use. We're going to need it because we're using both beds. I find that using weights for embossed cables helps even on passives. Embossed cables look slightly different than basic cables. The difference on the right side is quite minor. The difference on the back side is very noticeable. In the Pretzel Logic, these projects are made with embossed cables, and some of the projects may be made either way. Let's review the chart. The letter K in a box represents a needle on the main bed or back bed that is knitted. If the boxes are yellow, those stitches are to be cabled after knitting the row, and if there are dots in a box, those stitches are to be replaced first on the new needles. Arrows next to the letter K in a box mean knit the row first with the needles in the indicated position, then move the stitches 1 needle space over in the direction of the arrow. We begin embossed cables with all of the fabric on the front or ribber bed and lift purl bumps from that bed onto the needles that we want to involve in the cable. The chart tells you which needles to put into action for cabling. Wherever there are cables, there is actually full needle rib being knitted, so the beds must be racked so that all of the needles will pass one another when all come into work. And for this same reason, embossed cables cannot be knitted with the thickest yarn that the machine would normally knit, because that yarn is never suitable for full needle rib. Here I'm working on a Brother 260. You will know that's a bulky machine, and a soft worsted weight works fine. I would not try anything larger. The tool that you see me using to lift purl bumps onto needles is very helpful. This is an inexpensive loom hook for loom knitting. I use a metal file to polish them to a greater degree of smoothness than the cheap tools normally come, and to make it a little bit slimmer and more pointed, and it works great. I'm working on a Brother 260, and it does not require this step, but if your ribber gives you trouble wanting to drop the end stitch, for most patterns it's okay to place the end stitch on the main bed. I don't find this necessary on this machine or my Passip or Superba, but I have to admit that the Silver Reed family of ribbers, at least for me, is a little bit more prone to dropping the edge stitch. We can usually use all the same charts as we used for the basic open cable. And when the chart tells us to do so, we move the cable rope stitches apart in this case. There were 4 together. That's 2 stitches each for 2 ropes. They're moving outward away from one another. And after setting up all the way across the bed, we knit 2 rows. Then consult the chart, see what comes next, and follow those instructions. In this case, the cable ropes continue moving apart. It's very important that all of the needles that we empty go all the way back out of work, because if they do not, they may pick up and start knitting unwanted stitches. You will find you get quite fast at the transfers, as you do with anything you practice a lot. And when you transfer speedily, there is a tendency to fail to notice if the now empty needles get all the way back to the rail or not, and they really need to do so. In this chart, and in most of them actually, as soon as the 4 stitches have joined again, and this is actually a different pair of 2s, it's time to cable them. When we move stitches to and fro on the main or back bed, we are creating what's known as a cross in hand knitting, so I kept that terminology. When we pick up the stitches on the main or back bed and actually trade places, those are cables. The entire stitch design is referred to as a cable, but the action of crossing a cable only occurs when stitches on the same bed trade places. Right now I'm knitting the mocha colored pillow right in front of your eyes, and the cable ropes meet, get cabled one time, then begin to diverge. But as two ropes are getting farther and farther from one another, a different pair of two ropes is getting closer and closer to one another. I've skipped a little of the travel here. So new sets of 4 stitches are beginning to adjoin as you watch. And then these 4 stitches will be cabled. On this design, and I would say most of the time, the last cable crossed right over left, and this one will cross in the opposite direction. And doing that gives the appearance of ropes going over and under one another. We crossed right over left last time. This time we're crossing left over right. And I mean that literally on the front of the fabric. Since I replaced the left stitches first, they will appear on the front, going over the stitches that began on the right. For a really simple cable that only has a couple of ropes, it might only have 2 stitches. It doesn't really matter whether you go left or right. It does create a directional twist, but we normally don't care which direction, like for the little doll dress. However, in this case, with an all-over design, the cable certainly looks best if the direction is planned and consistent. Knitting the row after the 4 stitches are cabled is the hardest one in the whole cable chart on the machine. It is very helpful to do half of the work for the carriage by bringing the needles all the way forward. That's normally the job of the carriage. If we do it, we can reduce the strain on the machine by that amount. It's still likely to be a hard row to knit. For relatively new passive knitters, I must add, do not follow the instructions I just gave about knitting back from the all the way forward position on a passive, because it won't work. You'll simply break the needles and possibly damage the lock. The exact right amount of weight helps all machines to knit off the difficult rows after cabling. That includes passives. Another thing that helps all machines knit off the cable is to make sure that the stitch size used on the main or back bed is not too small. Longer stitches will cross more easily than short ones, of course. Anybody who is finding that there's simply too great a strain after cabling should re-examine the yarn in use. Make sure that it's light enough, the stitch size on that bed is loose enough, and also the qualities of the yarn. Soft yarns perform in this way much better than hard yarns. So that's it for today, but stay tuned, there's more to come. Next time we will talk about knitting a more eccentric cable. I find this one to be one of the more interesting visually, and it is achieved with a new symbol. I'll explain what the green in the box signifies. After that, I think we'll be up to trying a project together and knit the Barbie dress. And FYI, the American Girl doll dress is also in the book in 2 toddler human girl sizes, so your little girl can have a mommy-daughter dress with her doll. Links to the sale page for mostly classic cables and Pretzel Logic, as well as links to the rest of this video series, are in the program notes.